When most of us think about cloud storage, we don't imagine a physical space. Like, I know that when I upload something to Dropbox, that has to end up on a server somewhere, but I don't really think about the physical infrastructure very often. Like, it happens in the ether, it happens in the cloud. But of course, in reality, there is an enormous physical component to all of that. And those files, they end up somewhere like this, a data center belonging to Microsoft in Middenmeer, North Holland. Actually, this isn't just one data center. Microsoft describes it as a campus, currently taking up around 14 hectares of space, with construction set to break ground on a further 50. By the time they're done, this place will be nearly as big as Middenmeer itself. And we now know that for the last 2 years, these buildings, these exact buildings, have been the home to audio recordings of hundreds of millions of phone calls made by the people of Palestine. So many calls that if you were to try and dedicate a dozen lifetimes to listening to them one after the other, you wouldn't be able to do it. These phone calls, as we now know thanks to reporting from The Guardian alongside Plus 972 magazine and Local Call, were captured by an IDF intelligence agency known as Unit 8200. I'm going to interject here very briefly from the future to say you might be wondering why we're discussing all of this on a YouTube channel called People Make Games. And well, I'm going to get to that in just a few more minutes. There is a direct link between the video games industry and this surveillance that I'm describing. Just let's fill in a bit more context first, okay? Few more minutes. Now, Israel has been intercepting text messages and phone calls made from the West Bank and from Gaza for many years now. That's not new, but what has changed is that up until this point, the IDF has needed to be much more targeted in its data capture. It simply hasn't had the capacity to both store and monitor the communication of an entire population all at once. But fortunately for the Israeli military, Microsoft offers its customers two extremely valuable services for anyone hoping to carry out mass surveillance on a people being bombed out of existence. First of all, there's the near unlimited data storage. These buildings behind me are thought to have contained around 11,500 terabytes of data belonging to the IDF as of July this year. And then, of course, there's the AI tools. Here's how Microsoft describes what it has to offer on that front.
Decision superiority is key to mission success. With Microsoft's industry-leading artificial intelligence capabilities, you can modernize and automate intelligence gathering and analysis with AI and machine learning to empower decision-makers at every level and across all domains. The ability to share data is the single most important enabler to enhance interoperability.
Turns out these companies use the exact same word soup whether they're selling to the military or any other industry. I don't know about you, but I always look to empower my decision makers across all levels and all domains. Oh, sorry?
Do you have permission to take the video here?
Oh, that's. I thought this was. This isn't this a public road?
Yes, but you cannot film the data center.
I can't point the camera at it.
How long do you want to be here? Because we're going to
Okay.
watch you, eh?
Okay, sure. Maybe another 30 minutes.
Okay.
A little bit touchy about being filmed, apparently, the old data center. I mean, I'm not exactly the first person to come here after finding out this is where the Palestinian calls were being stored. Anyway, where were we? Microsoft has been pitching its AI tools to different militaries around the world, but the language it uses to do so, at least publicly, is totally empty and meaningless. I'm guessing the company doesn't revel in the idea of drawing too obvious a link between its services and the violence being carried out by its customers. An Israeli colonel put it much more plainly during a leaked video from an IDF conference in Tel Aviv last year. You have to understand, it's a platform that's a weapon, no less than that. So how did all of this work? Well, according to the sources who spoke to The Guardian, Local Call, 972 magazine, the internal ambitions of the Israeli military were to capture up to 1 million calls an hour. In essence, this meant that if a phone call happened in Gaza or in the West Bank, it were to end up on a server inside one of those buildings. These calls could then be transcribed, translated, and then analyzed by Microsoft's AI tools to create a huge archive of data, an archive that was then able to be used by the IDF for many different things, including the identification of targets to be bombed in Gaza. Here's a particularly grim follow-up to that from The Guardian's own reporting. One of the sources said when planning an airstrike on an individual located within densely populated areas where high numbers of civilians are present, officers would use the cloud-based system to examine calls made by people in the immediate vicinity. The suggestion there seems to be that this could prove an effective way for the IDF to justify the murder of bystanders who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time when their bombs landed, blurring the line between innocent civilian and potential threat. That kind of tactic is said to have been mirrored when detaining Palestinians in the West Bank as well. One former IDF officer told Plus 972 magazine, "These people get entered into the system and the data on them just keeps growing. When they need to arrest someone and there isn't a good enough reason to do so, the surveillance repository is where they find the excuse. We're now in a situation where almost no one in the occupied territories is clean in terms of what intelligence has on them." How many times have these servers been used over the last 2 years as Gaza has been leveled from the sky? As I stand here right now, the official death toll of Palestinians killed in Gaza is nearing 70,000, with the majority of those being children, women, and the elderly. How big a role have these buildings played in their deaths? But you know what strikes me the most as I stand in front of these buildings? I'm sure the IDF thinks of what was stored in there as some grand data set. I mean, without a doubt, it must have been one of the most extensive acts of mass surveillance in the entire history of the human race. But just think about the content of what these calls actually was. In this exact moment for the people of Palestine, this was brothers ringing sisters to find out if they were still alive, mothers calling family to find food and shelter for their children, friends mourning and grieving together. These were not normal phone calls. This was the trauma of an entire people as they were being starved, displaced, and butchered, with the rest of the world just standing on and, let's be honest, letting it happen. This is what I'm looking at right now, a vast archive of human tragedy, hundreds of millions of hours of grief. So why am I here today in front of this shithole? I'm here because Microsoft has now admitted to the enormous role it played here in enabling the surveillance of the people of Palestine during a genocide, although it certainly doesn't use the G word itself. And since making this admission, Microsoft has also terminated its contract with the IDF's Unit 8200. But the company did this because it was forced to by an entire movement of people across the globe, a movement which has involved applying pressure on this corporation both from within.
50,000 people have died, and Microsoft...
All right, so today's celebration did include some interruptions.
And from the outside as well, including a boycott which chose to target Xbox specifically. So I came here to see this place for myself, but also because this boycott is not actually over. It secured a major victory, but that is just one step. And if you're not already part of the boycott yourself, maybe it might be something you want to consider. In this video, we're going to talk about how this boycott against Xbox actually works and why it's not over yet. But we're also going to make sense of how on earth a landmark win like this was even possible against one of the largest, most successful corporations on the planet. There are literally no other examples of big tech breaking ties with the Israeli state in this way in response to what's happened to Gaza. So why did Microsoft blink first? To answer that question, we're going to need to understand the wider movement, hearing from the boycott's organizers, but also looking at how Microsoft's own employees have fought back against their company's war profiteering from within. And given this Xbox boycott is shining a spotlight once again on the relationship between video games and Palestine, I want to re-examine the video we published 2 years ago, where we challenged the industry's lack of action in the weeks directly following October 7th. Have things changed now that the world has witnessed what we call today the first live-stream genocide in human history? Finally, I'll be meeting a group of game developers working at Arkane, a game studio owned outright by Microsoft, who've come forward to support the boycott despite working on a game that would be, of course, a direct target of it. Okay, so a lot of ground to cover then. Let's talk about Xbox and Palestine. So, a few weeks ago we ran a poll on our YouTube channel asking our subscribers, asking you, how many of you are currently taking part in the Xbox boycott? We received about 11,000 votes, and of those 11,000, 64% picked this option. I don't know what that's referring to. In fact, judging by the comments, even some of the people who did actually vote yes here thought we were asking about an entirely different Xbox boycott altogether, one prompted by the recent Game Pass price hikes instead, which is really not the one we had in mind. And to begin with, these numbers caught me massively off guard, to be honest. We all live in our own little social media bubbles, I get that, but 64% not even knowing what the boycott was, what I was asking about, I hadn't been expecting that. But the more I sat with that feeling, the more I started to think, well, how would the average video game enjoyer even come across news that this boycott was underway? Because although the Games Press has been covering this story, the largest, most mainstream sites, certainly in the English-speaking world anyway, have also been the least likely to actually write about it. If you go and look at the front page of Twitch right now, you'd almost certainly have no idea anything was going on. And if you watch, say, a recent trailer for Call of Duty Black Ops 7, a game owned entirely by Microsoft, you will see boatloads of frustrated comments underneath it, but none of them, zero, zilch, are talking about this boycott. They're instead mad about, I don't know, aging? And so, if this is your very first time hearing about the boycott, you're not alone. You're part of the 64%. So first things first, let's catch you up. Back in April of this year, the Palestinian-led Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions Movement, often known simply as BDS, put out a call for a global boycott of all Microsoft products, describing the corporation as, and I quote, perhaps the most complicit tech company in Israel's illegal apartheid regime and ongoing genocide of the Palestinian people.
Microsoft has been complicit for many years, but we saw an increase in Microsoft sales to Israel and customized AI and cloud technology after the genocide. After the ICJ put out its ruling, Microsoft then decided to bump up their sales to Israel. And so that level of complicity is something that can't be ignored.
BDS has been operating for more than 2 decades at this point. Having been inspired by the South African anti-apartheid movement, it's brought together hundreds of different groups from across Palestinian society, including trade unions, refugee networks, human rights groups, all working in collaboration with activists from across the rest of the world, like Bala, who you've just heard from, in order to launch these campaigns against the companies it believes are most contributing to the Israeli subjugation of the Palestinian people. And because BDS has been running for 20 years now, and because it has that entire history of the anti-apartheid movement to draw upon as well, it tends to structure its campaigns in a very particular way. Take Microsoft, for example. This is one of the largest companies in the world, which makes it, in some ways, an easier target to boycott. It's a household name and one that almost all of us interact with in some way on a daily basis, whether that's using Windows, Office, Teams, Azure, LinkedIn, Xbox, GitHub, Copilot, Edge, or Outlook. This company is responsible for the very infrastructure, the digital plumbing that so much of our lives rely upon. And it's also this very fact that makes the company so difficult to break up with. A full boycott of all Microsoft products is, for many people, too daunting a prospect, too big a hurdle to jump. Which is why BDS launched its most recent campaign against Microsoft by targeting Xbox specifically.
There's no easy BDS wins, right? Every BDS win is hard earned, and there is a lot of collective pressure that has to come together to get to those wins. Tech targets are especially hard because we're looking at monopolies. Boycotting Microsoft is really challenging, right? But that's one of the reasons why we created a focus on Xbox, because this is a consumer product that is not necessary in your everyday life, right? There are tons of feasible alternatives.
Now that's going to be truer for some of you watching than for others, I'm aware. There are people in our audience, for example, who are game developers who may feel they have no choice but to interact with the Xbox platform in order to make a living. Or there could be some of you who have one console, it's an Xbox, and you simply can't afford to switch to an alternative just like that. That does not mean there aren't ways for you to be involved with this boycott as well.
BDS is not about purity. It's not about boycotting everything perfectly, but it's about doing what we can where we can to exert as much pressure as possible so that we can, put pressure on these companies to end their complicity.
So yeah, that's an overview of the Xbox boycott, with Microsoft's gaming division being presented by BDS as the easiest way for consumers to target this company as a whole. But even here, there are different levels of engagement for different people to consider. It could mean outright refusing to purchase or even play any game developed by a company owned by Microsoft or one of its subsidiaries, you could cancel your Game Pass subscription or pull the plug on your Xbox altogether, committing to not use the console again until the BDS movement is satisfied that the relationship between Microsoft and the Israeli state has been well and truly severed. Now, on its own, the idea of an Xbox boycott may sound kind of small. Like, how many Game Pass subscriptions would really need to be cancelled in order for there to be a perceivable dent in the revenues of a company valued at something like $4 trillion? And how big would that dent need to grow for Microsoft to actually do anything about it? I'm gonna hazard a guess here and say whatever figure that would need to be in this example likely hasn't been crossed yet. Likely is a million miles away from being crossed, to be honest. But for this boycott, that is not the only metric of success, because a campaign such as this one can act as a central pillar for other parts of the movement to build upon as well. BDS has been targeting Microsoft for many years now. This is not their first campaign, and that has acted time and time again as a rallying cry for other groups to take action as well. Even within Microsoft itself, that's taken the form of things like No Azure for Apartheid, a collective of the company's employees who've publicly signed their names to a petition calling for their employer to terminate all cloud computing contracts and partnerships with the Israeli military and government, including the one we described at the beginning of this video. Some of those employees have gone significantly further, hounding Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella every time it seemed he dared step foot on a public stage.
How about you show how Israeli war crimes are powered by Azure?
There have been current and former employees who've been arrested after staging a sit-in inside the company president's office, an action which then prompted him to give an emergency press conference that same day to talk about the incident and answer questions on the relationship between his company and the Israeli occupation of Palestine. Activist shareholders representing about $80 million of Microsoft shares have put forward a resolution demanding the company publish its own investigation into whether its military customers are using AI and cloud technologies provided by Microsoft to violate international humanitarian law. A letter co-signed by international legal and advocacy groups has now been sent to Microsoft's CEO and president, warning Microsoft that both the company but also its leadership as individuals could be held liable for the aiding and abetting of Israeli war crimes. The investigative reporting we referenced earlier, which has applied enormous pressure onto this company's leadership since it was published, relied upon whistleblowers coming forward, both from within the Israeli military but also Microsoft employees horrified by their employer's own complicity. This isn't about any one individual action, it's a movement we're describing, one that can push at Microsoft from so many different angles, both inside and out, until eventually it buckles. So, how does the games industry fit into this wider struggle? That's a question I wanted to answer before I returned home from my trip to the data center in the Netherlands. 2 years ago, we published a video on People Make Games titled "The Games Industry Must Not Stay Silent on Palestine," in which our guest host, Tamoor Hussain, questioned why the video games community wasn't doing more to speak out about what we were just starting to see unfold in Gaza. And one of our key interviews in that original video was Rami Ismail, the Dutch-Egyptian game developer who has been shouting and screaming for his peers to do more for Palestine for years now. And while I was here in the Netherlands, I realized he was the perfect person to catch up with. I wanted to ask him how he felt this situation within the games industry had changed over the last 2 years, and importantly, where exactly this Xbox boycott fits in to that wider picture.
When we did the original video with Tamoor, I think the hope was that there would be a bit of a rallying cry, that there would be more loudness, that there would be more response, and it's been quite quiet after. And that's not to say that nothing has happened. Like, I think there is a general sense of frustration with the world's inability to do anything or to act, but that doesn't mean that the pressures that are on the topic have gone away. And I think a lot of people are still just very scared, and not necessarily for unjustifiable reasons. Like, since I spoke up since the original video, and I've obviously continued to speak up over the past 2 years, I've heard multiple times from friends, investors, others, that people have been told to sort of like distance themselves or to step away from me because I was becoming too controversial or too political. And that never happened with any other topic. And I've been a quite loud person. I've been a quite political person throughout my career, or at least the latter part of my career. But this is the first time where I've had dozens of people come up to me and say like, hey, listen, there's certain people that are telling us to back away from you, and we're not gonna. But I think part of that is just because I have quite some reach and some name in the industry, so it's probably a little harder to step away from me. But for a lot of people in the industry, that kind of pressure is terrifying.
Now, although there have been important examples of support for Palestine from the games industry during these last 2 years, including fundraising efforts from indie developers and some other actions we're going to talk about later on in this video as well, I wanted to hear Rami's thoughts on how games, broadly speaking, has compared to other cultural industries when it comes to standing up for Palestinian life since the genocide in Gaza began.
I actually think we did worse. I think for the first time in a very long time, we did notably worse than other media, because I think traditionally games has been very good at taking these larger topics and talking about them and coming in and being very loud fundraising for millions of dollars. I think that's been sort of like a staple of our industry. It's like we want a good world because we want a playful world, we want a joyful world. I think for the first time ever, I can look at movies and say, well, at least they're very loud about it. And I can look at music and say, well, they're stepping in front of the camera and they're just saying the thing. And I look at games and I'm quite disappointed, I'll be frank, because I'm not used to this. I'm used to us being on the front line of important topics. Because we are the culture, we are the youth culture, we are what kids grow up with.
But why? Why do things feel so different this time around? What pressures exist for people working in this industry that differ so much to their contemporaries working in other kinds of media?
I think that's two parts. I think games, for how many personalities we have, is not a personality-driven business traditionally. Like games is a product-driven business, and I think very often when we have had political causes and we've had people stand up for that, we're not talking about a person. We're talking about IGN saying something. We're talking about a game studio doing something. We're doing about itch.io, sort of like bundle. Like we're very used to brands being the face of a thing, and that works against us right now because brands are a lot more susceptible to these kinds of outside pressures than an individual is, because the individual can just agree, like, listen, I'm going to take the blow on this and I'm just going to speak. I think the other thing is that right now funding in games is in a extremely precarious position. It's in a very odd position post-COVID, and we haven't come out of that hole yet. Like investment in games is very low. So I think a lot of people are also just incredibly careful of trying to lock out certain methods of funding. And since there are a lot of funding venues that might feel scarier if you are politically loud about Palestine, there are not a lot of venues that close for not being loud about Palestine. And that risk assessment just makes it very clear that, the better play financially is to just not speak.
My final question for Rami was this: what role can BDS play in this space? How does Rami view the Xbox boycott?
For people to feel that power, that ability of being part of something that does affect what's going to happen, I think that's incredibly powerful. I think the other thing that BDS does is it's anonymous. You don't have to say that you're doing BDS. You can just stop buying, right? And ultimately, for better or worse, that's how the world works, right? Like money speaks. The push-pull over BDS is ultimately like, do we have the right to spend where we want? Or can we be forced to spend on things we don't like? It's a beautiful act of rebellion in saying, like, listen, no, I'm just not going to buy these things. I'm not going to be part of that. And giving people that small but meaningful act of rebellion in a world that forces us to listen, I think is good.
Earlier on, we talked about how this boycott could act as a sort of central pillar for other parts of the movement to build upon. And there have been pockets of the games industry that have done exactly that. One of the most surprising examples of this for me happened back in August, when a group of game developers at the French studio Arkane, that's the team behind Dishonored, Prey, Deathloop, Redfall, they're currently working on Marvel's Blade, they released a joint statement. Now, it's worth saying this statement didn't come from the entire studio, but rather a group of employees who are also members of the STJV union. It's quite common in France for, within one company, employees to be represented by multiple different unions, and that is the case at Arkane Studios. And so these STJV union members, these Arkane employees, put out a statement in support of the Xbox boycott, despite the fact that Arkane Studios is owned by Microsoft itself. To be crystal clear about what this means, these developers were asking us to boycott their own work in the name of Palestinian justice. This felt hugely significant to me. Which is why I've come to Lyon to meet them. This union represents something important in this story because here is a group of game developers employed directly by Microsoft who've been able to come out publicly and call out the company. Inevitably, in doing so, they've asked for a boycott of the very games that they themselves work on. Now, there's some context to understand when it comes to this open letter and why it's perhaps unsurprising that it was a French games union that was the first to speak out in this way. And to begin with, well, the labour laws in this country are just a world away from what you can expect in many other places around the world, especially the US, where so many of Microsoft's game studios are currently based. And it has to be said, well, French unions, they're formidable. That's a factor. As I stand here today in Lyon in early October, there are demonstrations happening across the country with hundreds of thousands of people taking to the streets, various sectors going on strike in order to challenge budget cuts that are being put in place by the country's latest Prime Minister. STJV is a part of today's demonstrations. In fact, its members have gone on strike alongside so many other unions throughout France. So yes, I'm here to speak to this union about its decision to stand with the people of Palestine, a decision that inevitably has come with some significant risk for the workers involved. It's that risk that explains why the open letter was signed on behalf of the union as a collective, rather than naming any specific individual members. And it's also that risk that will explain the very significant precautions we've needed to take when filming the interviews you're about to watch. Why did you and your union decide to publish the open letter to Microsoft in the first place?
We saw that BDS was calling for a boycott of Xbox gaming, and we talked about it in the union, of course. And we thought that, hey, that's us. We're impacted. We're concerned directly.
We couldn't just be bystanders. Microsoft is our mother company. It owns Arkane. It was horrible for us to be linked to that in any way.
We thought that it was very important to get across to Microsoft, and particularly internally, what is happening in Israel thanks to the services that Microsoft provides.
In general, our union has been pretty vocal about the subject, even outside of Arkane, since a few years already. So it totally made sense for us to do something at Arkane.
What are the demands exactly that you're making of Microsoft here? Like, what did the open letter call for?
We're calling for the termination of all contracts and all future contracts with the Israel occupation force.
For now, they've been, let's say, very discreet or not very transparent with all their details. As we are employees and our workforces contributes to that, we want to know what is going on.
We're calling for a public audit of the connections between Microsoft and Israel and the disclosing of all information that could come out of this audit.
And the final one is to protect and uphold free speech within Microsoft. There's been people that have been fired for talking about it, holding vigils. There have been reports that they might be filtering on emails talking about what's going on in Palestine.
And until the demands that you just listed are met, are you asking people to boycott all games directly owned by Microsoft, including those that you yourself are working on?
Of course, we think that it's very difficult for us not to ask everyone to boycott. The money that Microsoft is making is contributing directly to the genocide.
Calling for that, of course, is difficult, and it's not an easy decision to make. But I feel more serene going to work and working on that game and hoping that someday people will play it and enjoy it. But also knowing that I took a stand for it as much as possible, not to be used in ill ways.
Some people that will have read your open letter may think, like, okay, hang on, you guys are game developers at Arkane. You're not a part of the Azure team. You're not part of a division within Microsoft that directly interacts and engages with the Israeli state. Why does it need to be you? Why do you feel in your role that you still need to speak out?
I'm not in the Azure team, but my work is benefiting Microsoft. So indirectly, I am contributing to the Azure team, or Azure team is contributing to my work. It can be seen both ways. We are part of Microsoft, so we are not in a closed circuit. We are all part of one company.
Obviously, right now on screen, you're blurry silhouette, your voice is distorted. These are some pretty extreme precautions that we're needing to take here. Like, from your perspective, why have those precautions been necessary?
Even if French law protects us a lot, it's not foolproof. Microsoft can still do stuff, and there has been occasion where, mainly with no Azure for apartheid, where people were fired for raising their voice. So we don't feel particularly safe to speak in our own voice.
But if it were to happen, we are ready to fight back, and our union is ready to use any means necessary to protect us and to make sure that the labor law is respected.
The other reason is that we think it's important to speak as a collective rather than individuals.
We are not alone in this. We are trying to join other movements as well. There are a lot of moving pieces in this whole situation, and we're trying to join up with bigger movements to have a bigger impact.
So a core demand of both STJV and the BDS movement is that Microsoft should immediately terminate all contracts it has in place with the Israeli military. Now, as far as we understand, the company has ended its relationship with the IDF's Unit 8200, as we talked about earlier, but does that truly represent the extent of Microsoft's contributions to the Israeli occupation of Palestine and the genocide in Gaza? It, of course, does not. Thanks to leaked commercial records from both Israel's Defense Ministry and Microsoft's Israeli operations, we now have a clearer idea of just how intertwined this company remains with the Israeli military apparatus. We know, for example, that Microsoft Azure has been used to maintain a system referred to as Rolling Stone, which was built by the Israeli government to keep track of Palestinians living in either the West Bank or Gaza and to monitor their movements. We know that other IDF units, aside from 8200, have purchased services from Microsoft, including Unit 81, which the IDF describes itself as one of the most highly classified intelligence units it has, as well as OFEC, an Air Force unit responsible for managing the databases known as target banks, which contain the potential targets to be hit by IDF airstrikes. We know that between the start of the bombardment of Gaza in October 2023 and the end of June 2024, Microsoft sold nearly 20,000 hours of engineering support and consultancy services to the IDF. We know that the IDF is a significant customer of OpenAI, a company which Microsoft has secured a very large stake in. Here's another quote from The Guardian on that. In January 2024, OpenAI quietly deleted its own restrictions against the use of its services for military and warfare activities as part of a comprehensive rewrite of its policies. At around this time, files suggest the Israeli military's consumption of the Azure OpenAI suite of products began to spike. That's just a taste of what came out in the most recent leaks. We don't know how much deeper the collaboration goes, of course we don't, but this perhaps gives you a sense of why the BDS movement feels so comfortable describing Microsoft as, and I quote, perhaps the most complicit tech company in Israel's illegal apartheid regime and ongoing genocide. Although I think it's worth saying that title is a contested one. The Guardian sources back in September suggested that Unit 8200 may have already transferred its enormous data set, those millions of hours of Palestinian phone calls, from the data center I visited in Midamir to an alternative solution provided by Amazon Web Services instead. Neither Amazon nor the IDF chose to comment on that allegation. It's also very public knowledge that Amazon and Google together secured a joint $1.2 billion contract with the Israeli government in 2021 in order to provide the government, the defense establishment, and others with an all-encompassing cloud solution. Referred to as Project Nimbus, this contract has been widely criticized for its contributions to the oppression of the Palestinian people and its likely direct links to the genocide in Gaza. You remember that leaked footage of the Israeli colonel that we showed earlier speaking at an IDF conference? Well, it's worth paying attention to the three logos that appear behind her as she's talking about the civilian capabilities that her military relies so heavily upon. Big tech is in this thing all the way down. Listen, I know this is incredibly fucking depressing, and it can be difficult at times like this to even imagine a world that could honor and value and protect Palestinian lives in the ways afforded to so many others that just so happen to have been born within a different country's borders, deemed worthy of humanity. Now, if you'll forgive me just one tiny lecture right at the end here, I think we have a shared responsibility as non-Palestinians to maintain that hope that things can and will be better for Palestine. I don't mean that in some kind of head in the clouds, hopelessly naive sort of way. I mean, we have to think that the world can change, even if we have to force it, kicking and screaming. There has to be a better world than this. If we give in to our own apathy here, if we convince ourselves that we can't make a damned bit of difference to what's happening in Gaza or the West Bank, then the Palestinian people truly are alone. Believing we can bend the governments of the world to our will, the trillion-dollar corporations and whoever the fuck else, is absolutely vital because, well, what's the alternative? There isn't one. It's a flame that has to be protected by us. That's part of our responsibility here. And yeah, hopefully you've made it through to the end of this video with that still being the case. And if you have, let me direct that feeling right now to a couple of actions you can take to feel active in this moment and to, in a real way, as small as it is, participate in the liberation of Palestine. First of all, if you believe you'd now like to take part in this boycott yourself, please take a look at nogamesforgenocide.com, which launched just a few days ago and does a fantastic job at taking the BDS boycott of Xbox and then breaking it down into different levels of action for you to consider committing to, depending on who you are and what your relationship is to the games industry. For example, if you're a games journalist like me, it asks for a commitment to halt any typical coverage of Microsoft-owned video games, but with an exception to be made for stories relating to certain issues, including, for example, union activity. All of this was written for the games industry, by the games industry, and it benefits so much from that fact. And if you'd like to, and you feel comfortable with your name being publicly listed, you can make a pledge here through No Games for Genocide to commit to the Xbox boycott. This is something we've already done as People Make Games, but it's worth repeating here as well. We refuse to cover Microsoft-owned games and studios in the way that we typically might until this company ends its complicity in the subjugation of the Palestinian people. Secondly, and this is hopefully something you've seen running alongside this video, we have a fundraiser up right now, you can see it on YouTube if that's where you're watching this, for the Palestinian Children's Relief Fund, and we would love for you to chuck a few quid its way if you can afford to. As the name suggests, this is a non-profit which seeks to provide medical and humanitarian relief to the children of Palestine, children who are growing up in the most inhumane, devastating of circumstances. The PCRF has been on the ground in Gaza constructing field hospitals and clinics, providing medical care to tens of thousands of patients and turning the donations it's received here into direct aid for those who need our help so desperately. 2 years ago, when we published our first video about the games industry's relationship with Palestine, you all donated $67,000 to the PCRF through the fundraiser we were running at the time, which was so much more than we could have ever anticipated. I have no idea if we can reach that kind of figure again, but if you can, please consider donating to help us get there. Any ad revenue generated by this video is going to get chucked into that same pot as well, and then if we cross, let's say, $25,000, People Make Games will donate a further $5,000 in the early weeks of January. The Xbox boycott isn't over yet. We stand with Palestine. Thank you very much for watching.